Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh, and welcome to chapter 8 of Isaiah. This is part 3. We're talking about the third wonderful child. Let's get into it. This is verse 16, and we are picking back up possibly what we started in the first part of this chapter, which was where Isaiah was to write in this large tablet that was to belong to his son Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And this seems to be continuing that thought. And so it says, bind up the testimony, seal the teachings among my disciples. So apparently Isaiah was to take many of his teachings and seal them up and keep them with his disciples. What was this sealed teaching? Well, we are going to have some references to a sealed book that's going to come up later in Isaiah, and perhaps that is this. But it's also possible that because of the stylistic differences from the early chapters of Isaiah to the later chapters of Isaiah, starting in chapter 40, one thought is that these early chapters of Isaiah may have been put together by his disciples from his oral teachings, which would explain why they are sometimes a bit shorter. They are sometimes a bit more chopped up. But then starting in 40, we have longer, more soaring rhetoric that is more deeply connected with longer sections of related poetry. This portion from 40 onward might have been more of Isaiah's written message. If that's the case, then that might explain some of the stylistic differences between 40 and later and the early parts of Isaiah. Now, I will point out that the majority opinion is that from 40 and later, it was actually written by a different author well after Isaiah's time. I'm offering this as an alternative to that thought of how it might be related to the rest of Isaiah. But perhaps that other portion is what is going to become this sealed portion of Isaiah. So these earlier chapters focus on narrative stories of his life and shorter fragments of teachings. We should not pass up the opportunity here to note that Isaiah had disciples. Did he set up some variation of religion that differed from the more common religion? Or perhaps he taught doctrines that others were simply not ready to hear? What did it mean to become Isaiah's disciple? How does one join that group? These are interesting thoughts about his place in his society. Moving on to verse 17. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. So we have here Isaiah explaining clearly that his children, particularly She'er-Yashuv and Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, but perhaps all the four wonderful children that he's talking about in these chapters, are signs and portents for all of the house of Jacob. And we have here also a reference to the Lord of hosts, his military title, who dwells on Mount Zion, giving a strong sense of protection to the people there. Moving on to verse 19. And when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers, those who chirp and those who mutter, should not a people inquire of their God for the benefit of the living to the dead? This is an interesting thing. Ghosts and familiar spirits that chirp and murmur. Necromancy was, one may infer, a widespread practice in ancient Israel. So much so that King Saul was impelled to make it a capital crime, which he then himself, in his last desperation, violated. It was believed that the spirits of the dead, when called up, emitted indistinct sounds, which a necromancer could then interpret as speech. This word chirp, also translated as peeped in the King James Version, we think that it is an onomatopoeic. The Hebrew word is tzaf-tzaf, perhaps that imitates the sound that these spirits make, tzaf-tzaf. It probably means something like the peeping that a bird makes, and sometimes the word is used that way, and it does not mean something like someone who peeps or looks at something, and that can be a bit of a confusion with the King James Version, which is why I prefer chirp here. The word only shows up 4 times in the entire Bible, and all of them are in Isaiah. This seems to be a word that he likes. And Isaiah particularly seems to like words where a syllable repeats like this, like tzaf-tzaf, which is the same syllable twice. He has a few words that are somewhat exclusive to him or that he favors that are of the same formulation. So we have here his condemnation of these people that are going to necromancers and asks them the question, should not a people inquire of their God? But then he follows it up with this strange final line here, for the benefit of the living to the dead. That's a little bit of a strange way to come back to this here. That last line, we would expect it to be parallel to should not a people inquire of their God, but it seems to go back to this idea of them inquiring of the dead. It feels like a line or two got lost here somewhere, and that's the best way I can describe this. But it seems to be that he is condemning those who will turn to necromancy, and instead of inquiring through legitimate sources to find out the will of God. In verse 20, we have this great translation here, to the teaching and to the testimony. If they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. It sounds here like what he's saying is to go to the sealed book, the teaching and the testimony, and see if the words of the dead match the words that he has given them in prophecy. And if they don't, it's because they have no dawn. This is actually kind of a interesting phrase here. The words of the purportedly murmurous dead are swathed in darkness of meaninglessness, and they're never going to have a dawn. They're not going to come back from the dead. And this phrase actually will become idiomatic in later Hebrew for anything that is hopeless or pointless. Verse 21, he will pass through her greatly distressed and hungry, and when he is hungry, he will be enraged and will curse against his king and against his God and turn his face upward. Again, a little bit of a hard verse here. What does this mean? Who is passing through what? It seems to be that this is talking about perhaps the dead that are passing through her. Well, what is her? One thought is it might refer to the land. Some translations actually put in some extra words here to try and make sense out of this. The word land doesn't actually appear in the text anywhere here, but the word land would be a feminine word, and that would match with the feminine pronoun her. So he will pass through her, perhaps the land, being greatly distressed and hungry, but he can't satisfy this hungry, and he's going to enrage and curse against his king and his God. This sounds like the frustration of the spirits of the dead who have no power, and then turning his face upward. Perhaps this is them looking up from the pit of Sheol in frustration. That seems to be the sense of what we're getting here, that they're going to turn to the dead, but the dead will not actually be able to give them an answer. Speaking of the dead still here, we believe, and to the earth he will stare, and behold distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. There's a lot in this that doesn't make a lot of sense. The words with question marks are all words that we really don't know how to translate. They occur pretty much only here. The grim fate of this person or people, it actually switches from the plural to the singular here, which is not totally uncommon. It indicates that they're going to be thrust into darkness. But this word for gloom, the Hebrew of the received text is me'uf tsukah, which sounds equally bizarre. The end of this verse and the next verse both use these same words. Now, I will note you may not have a verse 23 in your chapter 8 if you are using a Christian edition of the Bible. The Jews and the Christians actually divide the chapters up differently here. That's because verse 23 is connected with the verse after it in the New Testament book of Matthew. It looks like verse 23 belongs to this one because it reuses these same obscure words. The end of this verse and all of the next verse look as though they've been mangled in scribal transmission. Neither the ancient versions nor any scholarly emendations have proven much help to figuring this out. Robert Alter translates the word gloom as swoop, because the Hebrew word looks like it comes from a word which means bird. There's really no good way to get gloom out of it other than trying to put in a word that means something similar to the context. There will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. Robert Alter actually translates that as, for there is no swoop for him in straits. And he says the translation candidly reflects the unintelligibility of the Hebrew. So I'm sorry to say that there's really no way to make much sense out of this. The idea here of gloom and darkness for the dead does seem to be a prevailing theme. But then we have this last part here, which makes a little bit more sense, but unfortunately we still have no idea what it's talking. It says, in the former time he made insignificant the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he has made more important the way of the sea beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Now, the word that's translated as insignificant means to make light of something. Might also mean to curse something. The word that's translated made important means to make something heavy, the opposite of making light. And so we have here the idea that previously Zebulun and Naphtali were made light, and in a later time, the way of the sea and beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations, are going to be made heavy. That seems to be an obvious parallel between these two parts of the line here, being opposites to each other. But unfortunately, we have no idea what this actually means. There's no historical event or anything that we're aware of that actually matches this description. And the word Galilee is significant to New Testament writers, particularly because this is one of the few times that the word Galilee actually appears. But does it mean the same Galilee that is the Galilee of the New Testament times? That's questionable. It seems to be indicating a place that is beyond Jordan. But at least to the author of Matthew, it seemed very significant to him, and he tied it to the verse which follows. So really, we end this chapter with a bit of question marks, not sure what we're actually talking about here or what historical event is happening. We know this has something to do with them inquiring of the dead and not getting good answers, but we're not sure what that has to do with a previous time involving Zebulun and Naphtali, or a later time involving Galilee, or this place known as the Way of the Sea. If you want to find out what's in the next chapter, join us in the next episode. Thanks for joining us, and we hope that you will like and subscribe. If you found this episode useful, please join us on the next one. I've tried a few new things with these episodes to change up the formatting a bit. Let me know if you like it in the comments, and we'll see you next time.